And in that time, I have seen Catholic congregations go from mostly older people dragging kids along who will never go back, to a sudden plummet in attendance during COVID, to a revival of a very different demographic, which is much more young families, young people. I am very hopeful about the Pope, who I think is a wonderful religious leader. I'm even somewhat optimistic about Sarah Mullally, because I think she represents the turning of the page from the old order under Justin Welby. So in the principle that there will always be an England, I think we must also be Christian and never give up hope, because to give up on hope is a sin, and God will not allow that.
First of all, Steve Baker.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. I want to make 3 points. First, that optimism is rational, based on evidence. So, for example, artificial intelligence is now compressing drug and vaccine development times. AI can now simulate molecular interactions in work which would have taken years in the lab. So that is saving lives and compressing the development of vaccines and other treatments. Global trade had a record year in 2025, not least because of increasing South-South trade as people try to escape political chaos in the north. Preliminary data point to a 7% increase and trade exceeding 35 trillion for the first time in 2025. So trade is good news. Now, setting us, of course, aside for the moment the problem of intermittency, solar power is now crashingly cheap. It's an extraordinary thing that estimates of the cost of solar were out by a factor of tenfold. Crime has collapsed over 3 decades, not if you look at fraud, of course, or mobile phone theft, but overall looking at violence and burglary and so on, crime has collapsed. And the IMF now predicts that global GDP growth will be 3.3% in 2026, with the global middle class now being the majority. So if you look around the world, there are measurable developments in human welfare rooted in technological innovation, institutional learning and policy commitments, as well as, of course, market forces and innovation. The second point I want to make is that optimism requires effort. There are 5 main categories of news story. They are danger, scandal, novelty, human interest, and the sport. There is very little room in any of those for good news. Good news may sometimes appear as a novelty. It very rarely dominates the headlines. So to be optimistic, we actually do need to go on to humanprogress.org or Our World in Data and actually have a look at the explosion in prosperity that is taking place around the world and see that it is rational to be optimistic. And thirdly, optimism does require us to look up and beyond and above immediate challenges. I will not deny for a moment that we have the most profound challenges. Politics and the public sector is in a state of turmoil. International affairs, of course, are in chaos. And we've got 2 big problems with the welfare state. It's not good enough and we can't afford it. And that is catching up with us. But events in Iran, Venezuela, and especially Argentina show us that one way or another, nations and populations can break free of broken politics and things can be turned around. So that's my message. If you overall look at the great sweep of human history, yes, sometimes there are interruptions and difficulties, but it is rational to be optimistic. We do need to put the effort in to do it, and we do need to look up and beyond immediate challenges in order to get there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Sharp, succinct, persuasive. Tim.
Listening to Steve talk about the rise of AI, solar power, and the global middle class, I was thinking, well, I hate all of those things. But my day began on a pessimistic note when I dropped my glasses between my house and the station, and I had to walk back up the hill with my sort of bent over double looking at the floor, trying to find my glasses. And someone, with proof of good neighborliness, stepped out and asked if I'd like some help, which was very kind. And we looked around and we finally found the glasses. And I said, you know, this is just turning into one of the worst days ever. And I said, I'm just so grateful you happen to be out on the street here to help me. What are you doing here? And he said, I've just been evicted. So I guess I am optimistic about the rise in pessimism, by which I mean that I think people are figuring out that everything's broken, that I was always right, me and Peter Hitchens. The world is not just going to, but has already arrived at aisle 3 in hell in a handcart. and that from hitting the bottom, we can begin to work our way back up. So I'm sort of heartened by this debate over whether or not Britain is broken, because accepting all of those macro things, all those exciting transformations in technology, there's no getting away from the cost of living, from the general drudgery of everyday life, and how miserable everything seems to be. So I'm very optimistic that people have figured this out. And I think this means people will start to turn things around. And the second thing, because I was asked for two things I'm optimistic about, is I'm very optimistic about religion. As I don't just refer to the numbers of more people going to church, which, you know, some people dispute, whatever. If you go to a parish church for 20 years, you get a sort of a first page of history view of how a society changes. And in that time, I have seen Catholic congregations go from mostly older people dragging kids along who will never go back, to a sudden plummet in attendance during COVID, to a revival of a very different demographic, which is much more young families, young people. I am very hopeful about the Pope, who I think is a wonderful religious leader. I'm even somewhat optimistic about Sarah Mullally, because I think she represents the turning of the page from the old order under Justin Welby. So in the principle that there will always be in England, I think we must also be Christian and never give up hope, because to give up on hope is a sin, and God will not allow that.
Evangelical, but in the right way. Thank you, Tim. And now, David.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of agree with Tim that 2025 was so bad that things can only get better. And I think, you know, most of the global stuff is just, particularly in the last few days, has become too difficult to call. So I'm sticking to more prosaic national stuff. Although with one exception, I think one of the most important cultural events of this year is going to be that Taylor Swift is going to have a baby.
Oh.
And I really hope she does, because I barely know who Taylor Swift is. I've never listened to any of her music, but I am told she is incredibly influential among young women in North America and Europe, and perhaps elsewhere in the world too. Yes. We have a massive fertility crisis. We have unstable family life. We have incredibly difficult future economic problems to face unless we do something about our fertility. What the dependency ratio has gone from 1 to 5 to 1 to 2.5 in my lifetime. And if we could somehow make having babies fashionable again, and I think she is the woman to do it. Well, I very much hope she does, and that. I mean, we did hear the other day what was the extraordinarily depressing news that 1/3 of all conceptions in the United Kingdom, was it last year or the year before, were aborted. And, in many cases, this was not because people didn't want the children, but they felt for various reasons they couldn't. Anyway, that's my Taylor Swift point. We're going to have, I think it's going to, we seem to be at a sort of cusp on the whole social media kind of internet connectivity thing. I think we're just coming out of the kind of Wild West period, aren't we? We had one of the first retreats of one of the great tech titans over the Grok undressing scandal, whatever it's called. We've had the Australia example, Australia in the avant-garde. Basically kind of more sex and less scrolling is the potential story in 2026. If the Australians can do it and they can show that it's not a crazy idea banning social media for kids under the age of 16, perhaps 16 is a bit old, perhaps under 14 might be more realistic, then I think that's going to be a good thing for everybody. The rewiring of young people's brains is clearly a major problem. A couple of final, quite obvious things. I mean, falling immigration, I think, is going to continue. I think that is basically a good thing. We've had immigration has been far too high for far too long. I think this could be the year in which we stop the boats, not because of anything this government does, but because of what the rest of Europe is starting to do. Much of the rest of Europe is just starting to think the ECHR rules, even the Geneva Convention rules on these things, are just completely for the birds. Some form of offshoring will be agreed. probably by another European country, but we will be able to, even a Labour government will be able to follow in its footsteps because someone in Europe has done it. And what else? So I think the UK economy could turn out to be somewhat better than we're expecting. We've got productivity is starting to rise according to the Resolution Foundation. I think the welfare arguments will start to be won by those people who say, we're over-diagnosing people's problems rather than under-diagnosing them. I think possibly the best news of all for the British economy in 2026 is that Ed Miliband will be sacked. And the North Sea will be reopened. The Oxford-Cambridge thingy will be allowed to go ahead, and the defence sector, which is one of our last bits of manufacturing, will boom because we're actually spending a bit more money on defence. So I think the UK economy could surprise on the upside.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. David, thank you. So we're in danger of having a consensus, which is that Britain will be better because overall the world will be richer and we'll benefit. And as well as Britain being richer, we'll also be more interested in religion and more fecund. In other words, more of Britain will be like Spectator readers. But one thing that was striking, I think, amongst all of the contributors is that if one looks at the heroes of this year or of the future, whether it's Taylor Swift or the Pope or the scientists and entrepreneurs that Steve mentioned, politicians didn't feature amongst the heroes.
No.
They featured amongst the villains or they were irrelevant. Is that fair? And if so, why? I'll ask all members of the panel. Tim.
Oh, well, I believe this will be the year in which people turn on, tune in and drop out. I think partly because of the frustration with politics, which is reflected in the inability to choose who we think should be the next government. I think people are going to increasingly look to ways to improve their lives by themselves that have nothing to do with the state or the news cycle. And that might be in the realm of business, or I hope it's in the world of culture. I'm still waiting for right-wing culture warriors to start producing some actual culture rather than just writing about how awful the culture is. And again, I see that beginning to happen in a family-orientated way among religious people. So I think again, this is why I'm serious about being optimistic about the pessimism. I think the exhaustion with the political order that we've had is going to lead to people putting energies into new things. I also hope that the press and public finally allow Keir Starmer to be clear. He tried 4 times this morning in a press conference to be clear. He had to say, let me be clear, as if the British public have become like gnats flying against his windscreen. And I'm hoping that we will simply get out of his way and ignore him for the rest of the year.
Steve.
There are 2 ways to organise people working together: the government's way and the private citizen's way. The government's way is rule following and bureaucracy, and the private citizen's way is voluntary coercion, prices, profit and loss. One of these 2 ways works very well with great error correction mechanisms, and one of them doesn't. And for 100 years, we've been growing this idea that people's lives should be managed by politicians and authorities. And that is the system of society which is today failing. And no one should be in any doubt about it. I could go through all the data endlessly. But managerialism, particularly the post-war consensus, is today failing. And that is what we have to confront. And that is why the politicians are the villains. That's why the entrepreneurs and the scientists are the goodies. That's why the statesmen and women are the baddies. And we need politicians who are willing to say, people flourish, people do well, change comes when people are empowered to take control of their own lives under the rule of law, when capital is devolved in the hands of people who know what to do. One of the standout politicians and achievements of the last 14 years was, of course, Michael Gove and the schools reforms. Labour have been quick to reverse them. But that's why we've ended up with politicians as the baddies. It is the political system of organisation of society which is today failing. That is not to be an anarchist. That is to say that as conservatives and classical liberals, we should be saying it's time to get really serious about the failures of the state.
It's just to follow up on that, Steve, one of the interesting things I think in British social attitudes surveys, and again, one always has to take any of these surveys with a slight pinch of salt. But one of the really interesting things has been that for the first time in a long time, there seems to have been a decisive shift against the notion that more taxation and more expenditure would, provided it were spent wisely, be a good thing. And that actually there's been a move to believe that the state is trying to do too much, and that tax and spend for a majority now in the country is the wrong way to go. Do you think that we may have reached a tipping point in public opinion that will have sooner or later an effect on the broader political temperament of the country?
Well, I hope that is right, and that is what the project Fighting for a Free Future, Harry is the director, he's at the back of the room, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to amplify the think tanks. One of my supporters said to me, Steve, you should have a think tank. I thought, actually, there are plenty of think tanks. What we need is more influence for those think tanks, which is why we're doing the things which Michael referred to, the Substack, the podcast, educational programmes and a community to help amplify one another, because we absolutely must procure and accelerate that change in public opinion, because in the end, politicians will give the public what they seem to want, and we need the public to want something different, and that means reaching the intellectual class, that is the people who shape public opinion and make it what it is. We need journalists to be asking different and better questions, getting away from the mere politics of, as fascinating as it is, which party Robert Jenrick's in. That is actually quite important, but it's not ultimately the reason why we're in difficulty. Neither is it going to be the decisive element in any solution to our problems. And we really do need to get people to start asking, how is government big? Do we regulate too much or too little? Do we tax too much or too little? And so on. Have we had money that's too tight with not enough QE recently? You know, the questions answer themselves, and we do need to get those questions into the public debate so that we can foment that change that you refer to, Michael.
Thanks very much, Steve. David, you obviously, to general acclaim, wrote the political obituary for Ed Miliband. Are there any politicians that you think will contribute to a brighter future this year, or do you think that it will be despite, not because of their actions?
I think you mentioned my anywhere somewhere distinction. I think one of the sort of disappointing things about politics and our political class in the last sort of 10 or 15 years is that we haven't developed a kind of class of politician who can speak across the boundary between anywheres in some ways, to speak to both groupings. And I think at a time when politics has to some extent shifted from economic issues to more cultural issues and value issues, it's much harder to find compromises on cultural issues. So we need good politicians more than ever. I think one of the few politicians who actually does speak well about things other than economics is actually Danny Kruger. I mean, this is not an endorsement of the Reform Party, but I mean, I think he has a kind of eloquence. He talks about the way we live now in a way that other politicians struggle to. And I think we need, as we become more fragmented, as we have lower trust in not just politicians but public authorities in general, we do, and indeed lower trust in each other. We need politicians to articulate a kind of a plausible national story to all of us, constantly.
One person who does have, even if he doesn't articulate it, the support of somewheres and anywheres in the US is Trump. He has the support of traditional country club Republicans and the support of the what were once Reagan Democrats in the Rust Belt. But what he also has is a capacity to polarize the rest of the world. Do you think, David, and I'll turn to the other members of the panel as well, that we should consider Trump a reason to be worried over the course of the next 12 months, or might it be a liberation, however defined?
I mean, I think it'll be a mix, but I think it'll be more a source of worry and anxiety. I mean, he's thrashing around in ways that are so destructive now, even for his own goals. And, something like Greenland, he could so easily have got everything he needed, possibly even full ownership of it, if he'd just gone about it in a more sort of civilized way.
And Tim, do you think it might be an opportunity, funnily enough, Trump and his actions for Britain or other nations to emerge from the shadow cast by Uncle Sam?
I suspect they'll be tempted to hang around until he's out of office to see if everything just reverts to normal. Because there's probably a lot of thinking right now that this is just the emperor's gone mad. But once his successor's been replaced, things will reset. That would be a mistake because as balmy as Trump can be, he does actually articulate the direction America was going in anyway, pivoting away from Europe and towards the Pacific, and attracting jobs and investment back into the United States. Joe Biden did this as well. He did it through subsidies and tax cuts rather than protective tariffs. But nonetheless, that's where everything is headed. Trump's just doing this very loud and crazy and disturbing way. Trump will probably lose the midterms, in which case there will be a serious check on his power and there will be yet another round of attempts to impeach him. And he's not very popular right now, including with many of his base who did not think they were voting for someone who's going to go around carrying out regime changes around the world. That's not what they thought. I do think the simplest way to deal with the Greenland problem is to simply tell him that he's got it. Just fly him to somewhere green, bring out a military parade, and say this is it. And if he wants a peace prize, we'll give him a peace prize on an aircraft carrier presented by a woman in a swimming suit. I don't mind. And I think again, we're all just waiting to think, is he going to back down? Is this, my suspicion with Trump is ultimately Trump sees what he can get. He demands everything and then takes what he can get. So this is an interesting time to see, does Europe actually have the clout to say no to something? Because the Venezuelans have discovered they don't.
And Steve, how should people who believe in liberty as the most or a prime political virtue think about Trump? And are there other observations you want to make about what his presidency means for us?
Well, thank you. I mean, so a Republican friend said to me that Trump is a comedian who should be taken seriously but not literally. And I've tried to do that as a way of getting through these balmy comments. A comedian who should be taken seriously but not literally. I think when one is a classical liberal to libertarian looking at his policy, so for example, his tariff policy, there's an argument articulated by my good friend Shankar Singham that what Trump is trying to do is to open up the behind the borders barrier, trade barrier problem. So for example, the European Union might have low tariffs on American goods, but there are enormous regulatory barriers to trade in American goods. And it's true around the world. And for years, the US Special Trade Representative has documented, they've published recently a summary of all the behind the border trade barriers they face. So Trump, bear in mind his book, The Art of the Deal, and how he likes to operate, he will use real brute power to drive someone to the negotiating table, as we've just seen with Greenland. And it might be, where as a classical liberal, it might be that one can take hope from the perhaps fading belief that what Trump really wants to do is liberalise the world trading system, but on a fair basis, stripped of massive trade distortions. Just to give you one example, if China gives free land and massively subsidised electricity to steel production, don't be surprised if they wipe out everybody else's. So it is actually legitimate to engage in trade defence, not protectionism, but to defend against someone else's anti-competitive market distortions. That's Shankar's argument. So it could be that one can take hope from Trump doing that. But equally, he is a lawless man. And I think that internationally we have many treaties now which plainly are doing the wrong things. They're the wrong agreements for the modern age. But to simply throw them out and revert to the rule of power instead of the rule of law, I think is profoundly dangerous. And I think it's in all of our interests that as thoughtful people, we stand up for the principle that we should agree rules and then we should uphold them, rather than that we should be in NATO and yet threaten to take Greenland by force, which seems to me a monstrous threat to our institutions, our culture, our conventions, our way of life, and ultimately peace.
But if I may just say,
Please.
I say this not to justify Trump, but because I feel there isn't an understanding that much of what he does is, as I say, the direction of America anyway. So there is a lot of controversy in America about ICE deportations. That is, people who have been in America for a very long time being rounded up and thrown out of the country. And of course, one poor woman, one protester, was killed totally unlawfully, as far as I'm concerned, by the federal officer. At its peak, Barack Obama deported more people than Donald Trump did in his first term. Deportations of illegal immigrants were going on beforehand. Tariffs were going on beforehand. What he's doing is he's accelerating a direction that America was already taking. So even if he lost, aside from them electing a Mamdani-like president, he can't be elected because he wasn't born in the country, but aside from electing a democratic socialist, you're going to have some Trump form of government in the future.
Also, I mean, this goes way, way back. I've just been reading a lot about Bretton Woods. I've got this crazy idea. I want to write a play about Bretton Woods. It was so full of human drama.
Oh, yeah. And it's brave.
But they absolutely crushed us. I mean, Keynes came up with these really very good ideas that would have prevented the global imbalances. He wanted a much harsher regime on the surplus countries. He wanted to tax surpluses. He wanted it to surplus countries to be forced to upwardly revalue their currencies. These ideas, we'd been in negotiations with the Americans over Bretton Woods for a year and a half, 2 years before it actually happened. When it came to it, they just sort of threw them out. You could say they had like 45% of global GDP. We were the most indebted country in the world. But, we'd been fighting together in the trenches in 2 world wars. And they also... We wanted a huge loan from them at very favourable rates, and they refused to give it to us. I mean, this was 1944, 1945. I mean, this was kind of the height of the special relationship, and they just crushed us.
What is it that you've been reading, David? Is there a particular book, history, biography, or otherwise?
Ed Conway has written an absolutely brilliant book about Bretton Woods and all its dramas. I mean,
recently published?
It was a few years ago. It was drenched in alcohol for a start. It was 3 weeks this is where the kind of post-war economic order came from, the IMF and the World Bank. It was 3 weeks in a hotel in New Hampshire. Gilded Age New Hotel, 700 delegates from 44 countries, although most of the work had been done by the British and the Americans in the run-up to it. The Russians turned up. They were pissed the whole time. None of them spoke English, not even the translators. Keynes nearly dies. Harry Dexter White, the head of the American delegation, turns out to be a Soviet spy. Was he a spy, wasn't he? I mean, but he certainly handed information to the Soviets that he shouldn't have done. Lydia Lopakova, Keynes's Russian wife, takes her clothes off every morning and swims naked in the river in front of the hotel. I mean, there was a lot going on.
Steve has made a study of the monetary system, both nationally and internationally. So I can't resist the opportunity just for Steve to offer a couple of reflections on this, because it may be that one of the reasons to be optimistic is the death of fiat.
Well, possibly, actually. But yeah, twice my life was interrupted. I was doing my MSc in computer science when the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, and then I was about to start a company to sort out the back end of investment banks when the global financial crisis hit. So I spent 25 years studying what's called Austrian school economics, which really focuses on the monetary system. To keep it really simple, and I'll tweet this chart out later. On the point about Bretton Woods tied the dollar to gold and everybody else's currencies to the dollar. But in 71, Nixon severed the redeemability of the dollar in gold. If you look at a House of Commons and ONS chart, impeccable credentials, a price index back to 1750, what you get is a flat line, then on a linear scale, then a little bit of inflation through the 2 world wars, and then in 1971, it's categorically different. The value of money collapses. If you were to read Gold and Economic Freedom by Alan Greenspan, the former Federal Reserve Chairman, although he wrote it long before, he explains in there with crystal clarity that welfare states must have chronically expansionary fiat money. And Michael's very good to pull my string on this one. This is the unspoken problem that we've all suffered from. There's a brilliant video called Sats versus Fiat, which is from a Bitcoin perspective, but it explains how so many of the problems we suffer from, like unaffordable house prices. When I was talking to young people 14, 15 years ago, you could talk to them about freedom in the abstract. Now they're not listening until you talk about house prices. Housing has become hugely unaffordable, but if you go to pricedingold.com, houses in the UK today cost about the same as they did in the 50s, priced in gold. There is something profoundly broken with our society and with our social processes, because the money that we use in exchange is losing its value and has been chronically for 50 years. But the good news and the reason to be optimistic is, and I long since gave up persuading chancellors and the bank governors that we should do something about the UK and the world's monetary system. I think we could have had a new Bretton Woods. It's never going to happen. But what is good news is through Glint and Tally and others, you can now own physical gold in more or less any quantity. I work with Glint. And you can also buy Bitcoin. So it's now possible through the private sector and through entrepreneurship to put yourself on your own sound money standard. But it's not ideal. Governments ought to be capable of providing sound money. But because they're welfare states, because they live chronically beyond their means for decade after decade, they desperately need cheap credit and then QE in order to keep the bond market going. And I'm afraid you can probably see I'm really fired up about this, but is it easy to explain?
No. I have no idea what you're talking about. But I do have a school friend who's always trying to get me to invest in his cryptocurrency.
But this is the thing. It's one of those.
Sounds marvellous.
It's one of those problems where once you understand it, there's no going back.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
By happy accident, in this week's coming Spectator, we have a supplement on gold, crypto, and other investments that should, in 2026, provide you with an opportunity, whatever happens to the economy, to prosper. So I do recommend, and we've asked...
There's no such thing.
Well, we've asked...
Everything busts. Everything.
Well,
you're telling me you cannot lose on this investment.
I'm not saying
Everyone will invest in it, and it'll be 1929.
Well, one thing you cannot lose on is a Spectator subscription. However, we asked Andrew Jimson, and we explicitly said, "Can you give us a fogey's guide to crypto?" And it's a fascinating piece. But that takes me back to another thing, which is that in talking about this area, we had from Steve and from David book recommendations. I'll mention the three things which worry me, or three of the things which worry me slightly, to see if any of you think that there are reasons to be pessimistic about these or optimistic about these. One, is it true that we're facing a decline in reading, a crisis in books and literature as the younger generation turns away from immersing themselves in the longer read? Is it the case that we should worry that the rising tide of anti-Semitism betokens something more malign in our society? And is it also the case, going back to Tim's joke about Greenland, that actually in the UK we're neglectful of our green and pleasant land? Specifically, is it the case that we've become neglectful of the countryside? Is the way in which farmers have been treated, is the way in which people talk now, I'm all in favour of more houses, but they talk now in a scornful way about environmentalists preventing house building. Is there a broader estrangement, which means that actually the countryside in the UK and in England is seeing a slow decline? Three random thoughts just from me about why one might be pessimistic, but I'll go for the panel's views. Tim.
On the countryside, this miserable government wants to ban smoking, it wants to stop kids from drinking, and it basically wants to ban horse riding, which is what trail hunting is. Trail hunting is not hunting, it's horse riding with hounds, and this government cannot tolerate it. But the good news is they U-turned on the family farms, which is why I come back to my point about being optimistic about pessimism. This government's realizing its own limits, and look at the number of U-turns that are stocking up, either because they've realized how unpopular they are or they fly in the face of facts. Someone, I want to know who it is, if everyone can tell me because they're a genius, tweeted that this government will end in banning everyone from drinking and then setting up mental health hubs on every street corner to cope with the fallout. That's the kind of absurd logic that they're following, but it cannot be sustainable, right? And in that vein, a lot of wokery is being reversed. There is a consensus now on the need to control borders. Everything is moving in the right direction. On the point about literacy, the issue I don't think is not just that young kids don't want to read, they can't. They actually can't read because of the death of focus. But again, we're seeing people trending against that by things like schools are now overwhelmingly banning phones within the school. So I think that is a serious problem. But I think we're waking up to it, and I think think of it this way. If I could wipe my mind of every book I've read and read them for the first time, wouldn't I be the luckiest man in the world? And likewise, there's a whole generation of kids who've yet to discover Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and all these great writers who just got to make reading sexy again. Get Taylor Swift's baby to read a book.
David, any reflection on those?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, we've got the Australia ban, the under-16 ban. I think that could well be copied. We had a very distinguished figure like Hilary Cass putting her weight behind it just a couple of days ago. So yeah, I think that's definitely a cause of optimism. I mean, on the environmental protection side, I think we've just got the balance wrong, haven't we? You have famously riffed on the whole fish disco issue and the overprotection of bats. Do we really need as many bats as the bat protectors?
I'd rather have bats than the HS2.
Well, yeah.
If I have to choose, give me the bat breed.
We just need to rebalance, don't we? I mean, anti-Semitism. I mean, this is mainly coming from Muslims. In Western countries, I mean, there are a few weirdos like this Fuentes guy in America who's got some big following. But I think this is a serious problem within the Muslim community in many Western countries, and which will have to be addressed.
Steve?
Gosh, well, there's a lot to unpack. So on the point about polarisation, I absolutely agree that there's a serious problem of people polarising and hating the people they disagree with. So I work with Professor Paul Dolan. He's written a book called Beliefism, How to Stop Hating the People We Disagree With. We've just written a chapter of a book on Brexit for the 10th anniversary about how we can all move beyond and stop hating the people we disagree with. We have got a serious problem that when we disagree, it's a bit like racism, actually, in the sense that once you know a thin slice of information about a person where you disagree with them, in my case being pro-Brexit, or Michael's no doubt as well with many people, you think that the person can do no good on any other subject. And that's obviously wrong. And when it's in relation to race, everybody knows it's wrong. But when it's in relation to, I don't know, the trans issue or Brexit or COVID or whatever it might be, people tend to forget and depart off and become, viciously polarised. That is a serious problem. And you can see it bleeding into a whole range of issues. Michael, you very rightly talked about the environment versus housing. I think that's an issue. People are going to have hierarchies of preferences for what they'd like to achieve. If, like me, you own a modest detached house on the edge of the area of outstanding natural beauty, you definitely don't want anything built on the AONB. But if you're a young person desperate to own a house and form a family, you're probably much less bothered about where it's built, as long as you can afford it.